The transport shuttle's engines hummed as it approached Kepler Station Academy. Zara Chen pressed her face against the small window, watching the massive station grow larger against the backdrop of swirling gas clouds. The academy looked like a silver flower floating in space, its many arms reaching out toward the stars. She was 17 years old and about to become the first human student at the most important school in the galaxy. Her hands shook a little as she smoothed down her uniform. Everything had to be perfect. Humans had only joined the Galactic Coalition 3 years ago, and everyone would be watching to see if they belonged here. The shuttle docked with a soft thud. Zara grabbed her single bag and followed the other passengers out. The moment she stepped into the station, she knew she was in a different world. The corridors stretched high above her head, filled with creatures she had only seen in pictures. A group of Zenthari students walked past, their crystal-like bodies catching the light and throwing rainbows on the walls. They were tall and sharp, looking like living jewels. Their voices sounded like wind chimes when they talked to each other in their own language. 3 Veilani floated by on their anti-grav units, their long arms trailing gracefully behind them. They had 4 eyes each, and all of them seemed to be staring at her. Their skin was pale blue and smooth, and they moved like dancers in the air. Near a food stand, a group of Karathi sat together. They looked almost like earth bears, but smaller and with intelligent eyes. Their thick fur was different shades of brown, and they spoke in low, rumbling voices. Zara had studied all these species during her preparation for the academy. She knew their histories, their cultures, and their languages. But seeing them in person was different. They all looked so elegant, so advanced. She felt clumsy and primitive in comparison. She found her way to the registration office, following the signs that appeared in multiple languages. The clerk was a Zenthari with especially clear crystals in her structure. When she spoke, her voice had a musical quality that made Zara think of bells. "Name?" the clerk asked, her mandibles clicking softly. "Zara Chen. From Earth." The clicking stopped. The clerk's large eyes focused on her with new attention. "Earth? The Class 11 world?" Zara nodded, though she wasn't sure what that meant. The clerk made several notes in her computer, then handed over a datapad with Zara's schedule and room assignment. "Your dormitory is in Section C. Your first class begins in 1 hour." The clerk paused, then added quietly, "Good luck." The way she said it made Zara feel like she would need more than luck. Her dormitory room was small but comfortable, with a bed, desk, and storage unit. The window looked out at the gas giant the station orbited. Zara unpacked her few belongings and tried to calm her nerves. She had worked so hard to get here. Her grades had been perfect, her test scores among the highest ever recorded. She deserved to be here. Her first class was Galactic History, taught by Professor Quintel. The classroom was arranged in a circle, and Zara took a seat near the back. As other students filed in, she noticed how they looked at her. Some stared openly, others whispered to their friends. A few seemed curious, but most looked uncomfortable. Professor Quintel was an older Zenthari, her crystal structure cloudy with age. She began the class by talking about the different types of worlds in the galaxy. "All inhabited worlds are classified by their danger level," she explained. "Class 1 worlds are paradise planets with perfect climates and no dangerous life forms. Most advanced civilizations develop on Class 3 or 4 worlds. These provide enough challenge to encourage growth, but not so much danger that survival becomes the only focus." She activated a holographic display showing different planets. Class 5 through 7 worlds are considered moderately dangerous. A few species have evolved to sapience on such worlds, but it required very specific circumstances. The display changed to show darker, more hostile-looking planets. Class 8 and 9 worlds are extremely dangerous. Only 3 known sapient species have ever developed on such worlds, and all required significant technological assistance to reach space. Zara leaned forward, interested despite her nervousness. Class 10 worlds are considered uninhabitable for complex life. No sapient species has ever developed naturally on a Class 10 world. Professor Quintel paused, and her large eyes seemed to find Zara in the crowd. "And Class 11 worlds?" "Well, Class 11 worlds are what we call Deathworlds. They are so hostile, so dangerous that complex life should not be able to exist at all." The classroom was completely silent now. Every alien face was turned toward Zara. "It is therefore remarkable," Professor Quintel continued, "that any life at all emerged from Earth, which is classified as a Class 11 Deathworld. That sapient life developed there is unprecedented, though perhaps sapient requires further study. A few students made sounds that might have been laughter. Zara felt her cheeks burning. She wanted to say something, to defend her species and her world, but she didn't know how. Earth is a world of constant catastrophe, the professor went on. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, ice ages. The planet itself seems determined to kill anything that lives on it. Most of the native life forms are predators designed to hunt and kill other creatures. It is a world where violence and death are part of daily existence. The holographic display showed images from Earth: lions hunting zebras, sharks attacking seals, volcanic eruptions destroying forests. To Zara, these were just nature documentaries, but looking at her classmates' faces, she could see they were horrified. The species that evolved on this Deathworld show clear signs of their violent origins. Professor Quintel said, "Humans have a history of constant warfare, even among their own kind. Their entertainment often focuses on violence and conflict. Their bodies are adapted for fighting and running and surviving in hostile conditions." A Veilani student raised one of her long arms. "Professor, is it safe to have a human here? If they come from such a violent world?" "An excellent question," Professor Quintel replied. "The Coalition xenobiologists assure us that humans can learn to control their aggressive instincts in a civilized environment. This student represents an important experiment in the possibility of rehabilitation for Deathworld species." Rehabilitation. The word hit Zara like a physical blow. They didn't see her as a student who had earned her place here. They saw her as a dangerous animal that might be trained to act civilized. After class, Zara walked slowly back to her dormitory. Students stepped aside as she passed, giving her plenty of room. She could hear whispered conversations following in her wake. "Did you see the way she moved? Like she was hunting something. I heard humans eat other animals while they're still alive. My family says they should never have been allowed into the Coalition." In her room, Zara sat on her bed and stared out at the gas giant. Its storms swirled in beautiful, deadly patterns. She thought about Earth, about her family back home who were so proud that she had made it to the academy. They had no idea that she was seen as a monster here. She had always known humans were different from other galactic species. But she had thought that difference would be interesting, maybe even valued. Instead, she was a curiosity at best, a threat at worst. Her computer chimed with a message from her parents. "How's your first day going, sweetheart? We're so proud of you." Zara stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Everything's fine. The school is amazing." She didn't tell them about the stares, the whispers, or the way the professor had talked about humans like they were barely civilized beasts. She didn't tell them that she was completely alone on a station full of aliens who feared and despised her kind. Outside her window, the storms on the gas giant raged on, beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent to the small struggles of the creatures who watched them. 3 weeks passed at Kepler Station Academy, and Zara's situation grew worse each day. At first, she thought the other students would get used to her presence. She was wrong. It started small. Her homework assignments would mysteriously disappear from her computer terminal overnight. When she asked her professors about it, they would frown and suggest she must have forgotten to save her work properly. The lost assignments meant lower grades, which meant she had to work twice as hard just to keep up. The cafeteria became a daily ordeal. The food selection machines were designed to accommodate dozens of different species, with their varying dietary needs. Humans could eat most galactic food, but some combinations made them sick. Somehow, Zara's meal selections kept getting contaminated with exactly the wrong ingredients. She would take one bite and spend the next hour in the medical bay with stomach cramps. Study groups were another problem. Whenever Zara tried to join one, the organizers would apologize and say the group was already full. But she could see empty seats when she walked past their meeting rooms. The worst part was the isolation. Zara had expected to make friends or at least find study partners. Instead, she found herself eating alone, studying alone, walking the corridors alone. Other students would fall silent when she approached, then resume their conversations after she passed. The ringleader of her problems was Kethvar, a Zenthari whose family controlled mining operations across 3 sectors of the galaxy. His crystal structure was larger and more complex than most of his species, indicating both wealth and high social status. Other students gathered around him like planets orbiting a star. Kethvar had assembled a diverse group of followers. There was Silix, a Velani whose anti-grav units had been modified with expensive upgrades that let her move faster and more gracefully than others of her kind. Gormand was a massive Karathi, unusually aggressive for his normally peaceful species. Several other students from various worlds had also joined their group. What united them was their shared belief that humans didn't belong in civilized galactic society. The harassment escalated during a zero-gravity physics practical. The class was held in one of the station's recreation spheres, where students could float freely while working with electromagnetic field generators. Zara was concentrating on her assignment when Silix suddenly accelerated toward her. "Oops, sorry," Silix called out as she slammed into Zara, sending her tumbling across the sphere to crash into the padded wall. Zara's shoulder hit hard, and she felt something pop. Pain shot down her arm as she tried to steady herself in the zero gravity. Professor Thainel, an elderly elderkin whose species was known for their wisdom and fairness, floated over to check on her. "What happened here?" "Just an accident," Silix said sweetly. "You know how clumsy us air breathers can be in zero-G." The other students in Kethvar's group all nodded and made agreeing sounds. They had been positioned perfectly to witness the accident and provide alibis for their friend. Zara said nothing. What was the point? It would be her word against all of theirs. And she already knew whose word carried more weight at this academy. Professor Thainel looked concerned, but without evidence of intentional harm. There was nothing he could do except suggest that Zara visit the medical bay to have her shoulder examined. The breaking point came 2 days later during cultural studies class. Professor Quintel had assigned students to give presentations about different species and their contributions to galactic civilization. Kethvar volunteered to present on human culture. "I've spent considerable time researching the species known as humans," Kethvar began, his crystal structure reflecting the classroom lights as he spoke. "What I discovered was quite disturbing." He activated a holographic display that showed carefully selected footage from Earth's history. Images of wars, violence, and destruction filled the air above the students' heads. The scenes were real, but they had been chosen specifically to make humans look like monsters. Humans have been engaged in constant warfare for their entire recorded history, Kethvar explained. They have developed thousands of different ways to kill each other. They have fought wars over resources, territory, ideology, and sometimes for no reason other than ethnic differences. The display showed atomic bomb explosions, soldiers in combat, and scenes from various conflicts throughout human history. Zara wanted to point out that many of those images were from humanity's past, before they had learned better. But she also knew that wouldn't matter to her audience. But perhaps most disturbing, Kethvar continued, is their entertainment culture. Humans actually enjoy watching violence. Their movies and games are filled with killing and destruction. They call it entertainment. More images flashed by. Clips from action movies, screenshots from video games, footage from boxing matches and martial arts competitions. Again, the context was stripped away to make everything look as brutal as possible. They even engage in what they call blood sports, Kethvar said with obvious disgust. Humans will gather in large groups to watch other humans hurt each other for fun. They cheer and celebrate when their favorites inflict the most damage. Zara watched her classmates' faces as they absorbed this information. She could see their expressions changing from curiosity to disgust to fear. The Velani students looked especially horrified, since their culture resolved conflicts through elaborate dances and social ceremonies. The Karathi were shaking their heads sadly, their pack-oriented nature making human warfare seem incomprehensible. In conclusion, Kethvar said, his voice ringing with mock concern, I believe we must ask ourselves a difficult question. Can a species that evolved to solve problems through violence ever truly learn to be civilized? Is it possible to teach peace to creatures whose very nature is built on conflict and aggression? He paused dramatically, looking directly at Zara. Perhaps the real question isn't whether humans can learn to be peaceful, but whether it's safe to try teaching them. The class was silent for a long moment. Then Professor Quintel began to applaud and the other students joined in. Kethvar had clearly done extensive research, and his presentation was well organized and convincing. The fact that it was completely biased and unfair didn't seem to matter. Excellent work, Kethvar, Professor Quintel said. Your analysis raises important questions about the challenges of integrating Deathworld species into civilized society. I'm giving this presentation the highest marks. Zara sat frozen in her seat as the class moved on to other topics. She felt like every eye in the room was on her, evaluating her as a potential threat. When the class ended, students gave her even more space than usual as they filed out. That night, Zara found a message carved into her dormitory door. Deathworld Savage. The letters were deep and precise, obviously done with some kind of cutting tool. Maintenance would clean it up in the morning, but the message was clear. She was not welcome here. Zara lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling. She thought about her parents back on Earth, so proud that their daughter had made it to the most prestigious school in the galaxy. She thought about all the humans who were hoping to follow in her footsteps, proving that their species could contribute to galactic civilization. She thought about Kethvar's presentation, with its carefully chosen images and biased interpretation of human nature. He wasn't entirely wrong. Humans did have a violent history, but he had left out everything else: the art, the music, the literature, the philosophy, the science, the acts of heroism and sacrifice and love that also defined her species. But none of that seemed to matter here. She was the Deathworld girl, the primitive savage who might learn to act civilized if she was very, very lucky. Outside her window, the gas giant continued its eternal storm. Zara watched the clouds churn and realized that she was starting to understand how those storms felt. Beautiful and powerful and completely misunderstood by everyone who observed them from a safe distance. The next morning would bring new challenges, new harassment, new reminders that she didn't belong. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, Zara found herself thinking less about fitting in and more about what it meant to be human in a galaxy that feared everything human represented. She didn't know it yet, but that shift in thinking was about to change everything. Zara's first attempt to get help came the morning after she found the message carved in her door. She went straight to the Student Affairs office, where a polite Velani administrator listened to her complaints with obvious discomfort. "I understand your concerns," the administrator said, her 4 eyes blinking in sequence. "But you must understand that cultural adjustment can be difficult. Perhaps some patience and understanding would help the situation." "They're poisoning my food and sabotaging my assignments," Zara said. "How is patience going to fix that?" "Do you have proof of these allegations?" the administrator asked. "Security footage? Witnesses?" Zara knew she didn't. Kethvar's group was too smart for that. "What about the message on my door?" "Ah yes, maintenance reported some minor vandalism. These things happen in dormitories. I'm sure it wasn't personal." The administrator's tone made it clear that the meeting was over. She suggested that Zara might benefit from counseling to help with her adjustment difficulties, and sent her away with a pamphlet about cultural sensitivity. Zara's next stop was Professor Thanel, the elderkin who had witnessed Silex's accident in zero-gravity class. His office was filled with books and artifacts from across the galaxy, and he greeted her with genuine kindness. "I've been concerned about you since the incident in my class," he said. "How is your shoulder healing?" "It's fine," Zara said. "But Professor, it wasn't an accident. Silex hit me on purpose." Professor Thanel's ancient face wrinkled with worry. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have evidence?" Again the same question. Again Zara had to admit she didn't. "I believe you," Professor Thanel said quietly. "But without proof, my hands are tied. The Academy has strict policies about false accusations. If I reported this without evidence and it turned out to be wrong..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Zara understood. Even the professors who sympathized with her couldn't help without risking their own positions. That afternoon, the harassment reached a new level. During a field trip to the station's hydroponics bay, Zara found herself separated from the main group while examining a section of crop rotation systems. She was reading about atmospheric composition when she heard the door seal behind her. The storage compartment was dark and cramped, filled with the smell of fertilizer and growing things. Zara tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The control panel showed a red lock symbol. Someone had engaged the emergency containment system. She pounded on the door and shouted for help. But the hydroponics bay was huge and her voice didn't carry far. The walls were thick and soundproofed to contain the environmental systems. 4 hours passed before a maintenance worker heard her banging and let her out. By then, the field trip was long over. and her classmates were back in their dormitories preparing for dinner. "How did you get locked in there?" the maintenance worker asked. He was a Karathi with graying fur and kind eyes. "I don't know," Zara lied. "The door must have malfunctioned." The worker looked skeptical, but he ran a diagnostic on the door systems. "Everything looks normal now. Must have been a temporary glitch." When Zara reported the incident to security, they pulled up the footage from the corridor cameras, but somehow the recordings from that 4-hour period were corrupted. "A technical malfunction," they said. "Very unfortunate." The students who had been on the field trip all claimed they hadn't noticed Zara was missing. They thought she had gone back early. No one had seen anyone near the storage compartment doors. That night, Zara lay in her bed feeling more alone than ever. She thought about calling her parents, but what would she tell them? That she was failing at the one thing humans needed her to succeed at? That she was proving all the skeptics right about humanity's inability to fit into galactic civilization? Instead, she accessed the Academy's database and began researching the species that were tormenting her. She had studied them before, but only their basic characteristics. Now she wanted to understand them completely. The Zenthari evolved on a world called Kethminar, where vast crystal caves provided shelter and mineral wealth. Their society developed around family hierarchies and resource accumulation. Conflict was rare because resources were abundant, and when disputes arose, they were settled through complex negotiations involving multiple generations of family leaders. They had never faced real predators. The largest dangerous creature on their homeworld was about the size of a house cat, and it was herbivorous. The Velani came from Silixvel, a low-gravity moon orbiting a gas giant much like the one outside Zara's window. Their ancestors had been tree dwellers who developed intelligence as they learned to navigate three-dimensional forest environments. When conflicts arose, they were resolved through elaborate aerial dances that could last for days. They had never fought for their lives. Combat for them was an art form. The Karathi evolved on Gormandai, a peaceful forest world where pack dynamics focused on consensus and harmony. Their ancestors had been omnivores, but they developed agriculture early and never had to hunt for survival. Their entire social structure was built around cooperation and shared decision-making. They had never faced starvation or territorial disputes or resource scarcity. As Zara read about these species, she began to understand something that chilled her. None of them really comprehended violence. They had academic knowledge of it, but they had never lived with it. They had never been hunted or had to fight for survival or watched family members die from predation. They looked at human history and saw only senseless brutality because they had never experienced the kind of environment that made that brutality necessary. But there was something else in the academic papers, something that made Zara sit up straighter in her bed. Humans weren't just from a Class 11, Deathworld. They were the first sapient species from such a hostile environment to ever achieve spaceflight on their own. Every other intelligent race in the galaxy evolved on worlds with Class 8 danger ratings or lower. The academic literature was filled with papers theorizing that true intelligence simply couldn't develop on genuinely dangerous worlds because survival would require too much energy and aggression. The development of sapience required long childhoods for learning, stable communities for knowledge transfer, and predictable environments for planning and abstract thinking. Deathworlds, by definition, couldn't provide those conditions. Humanity was an impossibility that had somehow happened anyway. Zara found herself reading paper after paper by xenobiologists and evolutionary scientists, all trying to explain how humans could exist at all. The theories ranged from ancient genetic modification by unknown aliens to lucky mutations that allowed brain development despite hostile conditions. What none of the papers mentioned was the possibility that humans had evolved intelligence, not despite their dangerous environment, but because of it, that maybe the constant threats and challenges had forced the development of adaptability, creativity, and rapid decision-making that other species had never needed. The next morning brought another poisoned meal and another round of accidental bumps in the corridors. But something had changed in Zara overnight. She stopped trying to prove she belonged here. She stopped trying to make friends or convince anyone that humans were civilized. Instead, she started remembering what it meant to be human. In combat athletics, a supposedly safe sport involving energy barriers and holographic opponents, Zara stopped holding back her reflexes. The other students carefully planned their moves and debated strategies. Zara simply reacted, her body moving with the split-second timing that had kept her ancestors alive in environments where hesitation meant death. Her success rate in the combat simulations was unnervingly high. Other students began gathering to watch the Deathworld girl fight, their faces showing a mixture of fascination and fear. In tactical analysis class, while other students spent long minutes working through complex scenarios, Zara provided answers in seconds. When asked to explain her reasoning, her responses revealed a fundamental difference in thinking. Where other species saw patterns and logical progressions, humans saw threats and opportunities. Professor Quintel began using Zara as an example in her discussions, though not always in ways that made Zara comfortable. "Notice how the human student approaches this problem," she would say. "See how quickly she identifies potential dangers and escape routes. This is typical Deathworld thinking, always assuming the worst possible outcome and preparing for it." The other students would nod and take notes, studying Zara like she was a fascinating specimen rather than a classmate. But Zara was done caring about their comfort. She had tried to be what they wanted, a tamed savage who could act civilized. Now she was ready to show them what humans actually were, survivors who had crawled off a world that should have killed them and reached for the stars anyway. The confrontation was coming soon. She could feel it in the way Keithavar and his group watched her, in the escalating harassment, in the growing tension that filled every room she entered. When it came, Zara would be ready. After all, humans had always been good at surviving things that should have destroyed them. The change in Zara became obvious to everyone around her. In combat athletics, she moved like liquid lightning, her reactions so fast they seemed almost supernatural to students from peaceful worlds. While Xanthari students calculated angles and Velani planned graceful maneuvers, Zara simply acted. Professor Veltar, the elderkin who taught combat athletics, found himself studying Zara with scientific fascination. "Remarkable," he muttered during one session as Zara demolished a particularly complex holographic scenario. "The human nervous system processes threat assessment at least 40% faster than any other known species." Other students gathered around the training area to watch her sessions. They whispered among themselves, pointing at the way she moved, the way her eyes constantly scanned for dangers and opportunities. What they saw unsettled them in ways they couldn't quite explain. Zara heard their whispers but didn't care anymore. She had spent weeks trying to make herself smaller, quieter, less threatening. Now she moved with the casual confidence of a predator who had stopped pretending to be prey. In Professor Quintel's strategic analysis class, the change was even more dramatic. The professor presented a simulation of a space station under attack by pirates, asking students to devise defensive strategies. The Xanthari students formed committees to discuss resource allocation. The Velani created elegant flowcharts showing optimal evacuation procedures. The Karathi focused on diplomatic solutions and hostage negotiations. Zara looked at the simulation for 30 seconds and said, "Cut life support to sections 12 through 18. When the pirates breach the outer hull there, they'll be unconscious in minutes. Then you can board their ships and take control of their fleet." The classroom fell silent. Professor Quintel's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation in her species. "That strategy would work," she admitted slowly. "But it's rather brutal. What if there are innocent hostages in those sections? Then you evacuate them first," Zara said. "The pirates won't expect you to sacrifice part of your own station as a trap. They'll walk right into it. And if some of them survive the oxygen loss," Zara shrugged, "then they'll be weakened and disoriented when you board their ships." "Easy to capture." The other students stared at her. The casual way she discussed cutting life support and boarding enemy vessels made them deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't the careful, methodical planning they were used to. This was something else entirely. Keithvar and his group watched these changes with growing anger. They had expected to break the human girl, to prove that Deathworld savages couldn't handle civilized society. Instead, Zara seemed to be becoming more dangerous by the day. "She's not even trying to hide it anymore," Silex whispered during one of their private meetings. "Did you see how she looked at me in the corridor yesterday? Like she was deciding which bones to break first. My family didn't spend a fortune getting me into this academy, just to watch some primitive beast intimidate everyone," Keithvar replied. His crystal structure flashed with angry light. It's time to remind her what happens to creatures who don't know their place. Gorman shifted uncomfortably. Despite his size, the Karathi was beginning to have doubts about their campaign against Zara. Something about the way she moved lately made his pack instincts scream warnings at him. Maybe we should just leave her alone, he rumbled. She's not really bothering anyone. She's bothering me, Kethavar snapped. And she's making the other students think that humans belong here. We can't allow that. The confrontation came 3 days later. Zara was walking through a maintenance corridor between classes, taking a shortcut she had discovered that avoided the main hallways and their crowds of staring students. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, lined with pipes and conduits that hummed with the station's life support systems. She heard them before she saw them. Footsteps echoing off the metal walls. Too many to be coincidental. Kethavar emerged from a side passage ahead of her, blocking her path. Silix dropped down from an overhead maintenance hatch, her anti-grav units whining softly. Gorman stepped out from behind her, cutting off her retreat. 2 other students flanked them, a tall Zalari with crystalline skin and a squat Mordani whose thick hide could stop most energy weapons. They had planned this carefully, choosing a location where security cameras couldn't see them and where no one would hear what happened. "Hello? Savage," Kethavar said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "We need to have a conversation." Zara stopped walking and looked at each of them in turn. 5 against 1. In a narrow space that limited her movement options. They were all larger than her, and most of them were stronger. This should have been terrifying. Instead, Zara felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving at the academy, a sense of clarity. This was familiar territory. This was a problem she understood how to solve. "What do you want?" she asked calmly. "We want you to leave," Silix said, floating closer on her modified anti-grav units. "Withdraw from the academy. Go back to your little Deathworld where you belong. And if I don't?" Kethavar's crystal structure flared brighter. "Then we'll have to help you understand why staying is a bad idea." The Zalari student flexed his claws, which were designed for climbing crystal formations, but could serve other purposes. The Mordani cracked his knuckles, producing sounds like rocks grinding together. Zara looked at them and realized they had made a fundamental error in their planning. They had studied human anatomy and knew that humans were smaller and appeared weaker than most of their species. What they hadn't studied was human psychology. They thought of this as intimidation, a show of force designed to make her submit. They expected her to cower and beg and promise to leave them alone. They didn't understand that humans had evolved being hunted by creatures far larger and more dangerous than they were. "Okay," Zara said quietly. "Let's have that conversation." The fight lasted exactly 47 seconds. Kethavar moved first, his crystalline arms reaching for her with confidence born of size and numbers. Zara stepped inside his reach and drove her palm into the stress point where his main body crystal met his left arm. The structure, so impressive in peaceful environments, shattered with a sound like wind chimes falling. Silix tried to use her anti-grav units to attack from above, but Zara grabbed one of the units as she passed and used the Velani's own momentum to slam her into the corridor wall. The anti-grav unit sparked and failed, sending Silix tumbling to the floor. The Zalari student slashed at her with his claws, but they were designed for gripping smooth crystal, not fighting. Zara caught his wrist and twisted, applying pressure to nerve clusters that every human child learned about unconsciously. He screamed and dropped to his knees. Gorman charged her with all the mass his species was famous for, but Zara had grown up watching Earth documentaries about creatures far larger than a Karathi. She stepped aside at the last second and used his own weight to send him crashing into the wall. The Mordani was the most dangerous. His hide really could stop energy weapons, and his strength was impressive. But his species had evolved as peaceful herbivores, and he telegraphed his movements like a training hologram. Zara ducked under his swing and struck him in the solar plexus with exactly the right force to shut down his breathing, without causing permanent damage. When the corridor fell silent, Zara was standing calmly over 5 groaning aliens checking her chronometer. Her heart rate hadn't even elevated significantly. Security arrived 6 minutes later, alerted by the noise. They found Zara sitting against the wall, offering water pouches to her attackers while explaining basic first aid procedures. "What happened here?" the security chief demanded. He was a massive Karathi, larger even than Gormond, with the kind of presence that usually made problems disappear just by showing up. 5 students attacked me, Zara said simply. I defended myself. The security chief looked at the scene. 5 large aliens in various states of injury, 1 small human without a scratch on her. His expression suggested he was having trouble processing what he was seeing. They're all going to be fine, Zara added helpfully. Kethvar needs medical attention for his arm crystal, and the Mordani should have his breathing checked. But everyone else just has bruises. The security footage from the main corridors showed the 5 students entering the maintenance area together, clearly planning something. Their earlier harassment campaigns were suddenly viewed in a new light as security began connecting dots they had previously ignored. Within an hour, the footage of Zara's 47-second victory was spreading through the Academy's networks. Students who had never paid attention to the quiet human girl suddenly saw her in a completely different light. The way she moved, the way she assessed threats, the casual competence with which she had handled 5 larger opponents. It all spoke to something that no other species in the galaxy possessed: the ability to survive and thrive in conditions that would kill anyone else. Director Valthun wanted to expel Zara immediately, but the evidence was overwhelmingly clear that she had acted in self-defense. More problematically, news of the incident reached Earth's diplomatic corps within hours. Suddenly, there were uncomfortable questions being asked about humanity's treatment in supposedly enlightened galactic society. The morning after the fight brought changes that Zara hadn't expected. As she walked through the corridors to breakfast, students moved aside not with the fearful avoidance she had grown used to, but with something that looked almost like respect. The whispered conversations followed her as always, but the tone had shifted completely. Did you see the security footage? She moved like lightning. 5 of them, and she didn't even break a sweat. My roommate says Kethvar's family is furious. Apparently his arm crystal will take months to heal properly. In the cafeteria, Zara noticed that her food selections were no longer being contaminated. The serving staff, mostly members of peaceful species who had seemed terrified of her before, now served her meals with careful precision. Not fearful exactly, but deeply respectful in the way one might handle a powerful piece of equipment. The biggest change came during Professor Quintel's cultural studies class. Kethvar was absent, recovering in the medical bay, but his empty seat seemed to dominate the room. The professor had clearly prepared a different lesson than originally planned. Yesterday's events have prompted me to reconsider some of my previous presentations, Professor Quintel began. Her mandibles clicked thoughtfully as she addressed the class. I have spent considerable time studying human history and culture, but I realize I may have focused too heavily on certain aspects while ignoring others. She activated the holographic display, but instead of the warfare footage that had filled Kethvar's presentation, it showed different images. Human rescue workers running into burning buildings, medical teams working in disaster zones, scientists sacrificing years of their lives to develop vaccines and treatments for diseases. I want to discuss something that is unique among all known sapient species, Professor Quintel said. The concept of self-sacrifice for strangers. A Velani student raised one of her graceful arms. Professor, many species engage in altruistic behavior within their social groups. True, Professor Quintel replied. Zenthari preserve their family lines. Velani protect their flight groups. Karathi maintain their packs. But humans... She paused, looking directly at Zara. Humans will die for complete strangers. They will sacrifice themselves for abstract concepts like justice or freedom. New images appeared. Firefighters rescuing people they had never met. Soldiers defending civilians from other worlds. Human aid workers treating alien refugees during the Proxima crisis 3 years earlier. During the research for this presentation, I discovered something remarkable. Professor Quintel continued. In the 73 documented cases of sapient species making contact with each other, there have been exactly 4 instances of one species sacrificing their lives to save members of another species. They had just met. The classroom was completely silent. All 4 instances involved humans, she said quietly. Zara remembered those incidents. The freighter captain who had stayed behind to evacuate a Karathi passenger ship when their engines failed. The medical team that had exposed themselves to radiation to treat Velani survivors of a reactor accident. the diplomat who had thrown herself between an assassin and a Zenthari ambassador she had met only hours earlier. Perhaps, Professor Quintel said, what we have been calling primitive violence is actually something far more complex. Perhaps a species that evolved to fight and survive and sacrifice has developed forms of courage and determination that we, in our peaceful worlds, have never needed to understand. The implications hung in the air like a challenge. Zara could see her classmates processing this new perspective, trying to reconcile it with everything they thought they knew about humans. The discussion that followed was unlike any classroom conversation Zara had experienced at the academy. Students asked genuine questions about human culture, history, and motivations. They wanted to understand how a species could be both violent and altruistic, both dangerous and protective. For the first time since arriving at Kepler Station Academy, Zara found herself explaining human nature not as an apology, but as something worth understanding. You have to realize, she told a curious Zenthari student, that Earth really is as dangerous as everyone says. But that danger didn't just make us violent. It made us adaptable. When your survival depends on working together against threats bigger than any individual, you learn to value your group more than yourself. But how do you control the violent impulses? Asked Avelani. We don't eliminate them, Zara replied. We direct them. A human's protective instincts can be just as fierce as our aggressive ones. The same traits that make us dangerous to enemies make us willing to die for our friends. The weeks that followed brought a gradual transformation in how Zara was perceived around the academy. Students began approaching her with questions about tactical problems and strategic scenarios. Her insights, once dismissed as primitive thinking, were now valued as unique perspectives that other species couldn't provide. When a terrorist attack struck a nearby mining facility, it was Zara who correctly predicted the attacker's likely escape routes and strategies. Her analysis helped station security coordinate an effective response that saved dozens of lives. Professor Veltar invited her to assist in training simulations, where her ability to think like both predator and prey provided crucial insights for students who might one day face real dangers in space. Even Director Valthun, despite his obvious discomfort with human students, couldn't ignore Zara's contributions to the Academy's reputation. Her tactical analyses were being cited in academic papers across the galaxy, and requests for human consultants were flooding Earth's diplomatic channels. The semester culminated with the annual Academy Awards ceremony, where outstanding students were recognized for their achievements. Zara had never expected to be considered for any honors. She had spent too much of the semester just surviving to focus on academic excellence, but, as Director Valthun read the list of recipients for the Kepler Academy Award for Academic Excellence, Zara heard her name called. She walked to the stage past rows of alien faces, seeing expressions that had transformed over the past months from fear and disgust to curiosity and respect. The award itself was a beautiful crystal sculpture that seemed to contain swirling galaxies within its structure. Miss Chen, Director Valthun said as he handed her the award, speaking quietly so the recording devices wouldn't pick up his words. When you first arrived here, I was certain that admitting a human student was a mistake that would end in disaster. Zara waited, unsure where this was heading. I was wrong about the disaster, he continued, but perhaps I was also wrong about the mistake. Your contributions this semester have been illuminating. You have shown us perspectives we never knew we were missing. He paused, his expression conflicted. Perhaps we have much to learn from Deathworld species after all. Zara smiled, not the careful, apologetic expression she had worn during her first weeks, but the confident grin of someone who had found her place. Director, she replied quietly. You have no idea. As the ceremony concluded and students dispersed, Zara noticed something that would have seemed impossible when she first arrived. Groups of alien students were lingering, clearly hoping to speak with her. They had questions about human culture, requests for help with strategic problems, and invitations to study groups. Walking back to her dormitory, Zara passed a bulletin board where academy announcements were posted. Among the usual notices about class schedules and social events, she spotted something new. Applications for the next semester were arriving from prospective human students at unprecedented rates. Word had spread through Earth's educational systems that the first human at Kepler Academy hadn't just survived, she had thrived. The galaxy was beginning to understand that humanity's emergence from a Class 11 Deathworld wasn't a fluke or a statistical anomaly. It was the emergence of something new and potentially transformative in galactic civilization. In her room that night, Zara composed a message to her parents. "The Academy is everything you hoped it would be," she wrote. "I'm learning so much, and I think I'm teaching the other students a few things too. The galaxy is a bigger place than we thought, with room for all kinds of different thinking." She didn't mention the bullying, the harassment, or the fight that had changed everything. Those were human stories, and her parents would understand them instinctively. What mattered was the outcome. Humanity had proven it belonged among the stars. Outside her window, the gas giant continued its eternal storm, beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent to the small struggles of the creatures who watched it. But Zara no longer felt small when she looked at those storms. She felt like what she had always been but had temporarily forgotten. A survivor from a world that had tried to kill her ancestors for millions of years and had only made them stronger. The Deathworld girl had indeed not laughed along with their jokes. Instead, she had taught them something far more valuable. Why underestimating humans was a mistake the galaxy could no longer afford to make. Applications from human students continued to pour in. Diplomatic channels buzzed with requests for cultural exchanges. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the Galactic Coalition, officials were quietly beginning to revise humanity's classification from dangerous curiosity to strategic asset.